Hello everyone, Jeff of the Green Review. You've heard the terms shorelines, marshes, bogs, wetlands, swamps, and maybe even rain gardens, backyard ponds, retention ponds. All of these things share the idea that you have water in the soil, and maybe it's visible, maybe it's not, and there's a lot of plants that grow in those areas. Now those plants, if they're growing down in the lower levels, are going to be flooded. The root systems especially will be flooded. The plant may be growing out of the water. And then they're farther up the shoreline, there's going to be plants that are growing in the mud. They're never really underwater, but their roots are always in a muddy soil. And then farther up the shoreline from that, there are plants that are getting flooded some of the time, so the roots are wet and then they're dry, and then they're wet and they're dry, depending on the water level changes in that particular habitat. Now, the plants along the edge of those wet areas and the dry areas are a lot of times called marginal plants. They're on the margin between two different habitats, a dry habitat and a wet habitat. So they're marginal plants. There's also plants that are emergent, where the plant is growing, the root system is under the water, and then the plant grows out of the water. Everybody knows cattails, for instance. And then there are plants that are growing in a wet prairie, or what's called a mesic prairie. So the soil gets flooded and it stays wet, but there's never really water anywhere above the soil. Maybe occasionally during a rain or right after a rain. Now, in all those habitats, there are, just like the rest of our dryland situations, there are annuals and perennials. And there are tropical perennials that we treat as annuals in those areas. So here in this little backyard pond on the shoreline, we have a bird bath area. It's deeper water out here and it's shallower back here, and it goes completely dry looking here, even though there's water underneath this gravel for 5 or 6 feet more behind me. So we have a variety of water depths here for the fish out there, frogs along the shoreline, birds to take baths in, and then for the plants to grow in. So some of these plants like to be closer to the level of the water, and some of them like to be higher, where their roots can go out into the wet gravel and occasionally go down into the water underneath. So there are thousands of different kinds of plants growing in those areas along shorelines. I don't like the term marginal. I'd prefer the term shoreline because it's a lot easier to understand. Now, a lot of these plants, if you look at the naming of plants, you'll have marsh marigold, which is bright yellow flowers in the spring, or swamp milkweed, which has pink flowers in the summer. So there's a lot of plants that have the name that you can understand quickly that that's a plant that can grow along your shoreline, whether it's a retention pond or a backyard pond like this. So we have plenty of perennials and annuals. Like in this case, there's some astilbe here, there's turtlehead over here that are perennials that stay here all the time. Marsh marigold is down here. And so we have a lot of perennials along the shoreline, and they're not in pots, they're just planted into the gravel. And then we have the tropical perennials that we're treating as annuals, or maybe a plant that we have to do some extra work for, such as this canna, or then it's just plain annuals like these impatiens that are growing in the water right here. Oh, and I can't forget the perennial swamp rose mallow with their huge red and white and striped flowers. We have a lot of those along the shoreline of this particular water garden because they're such showy plants. And then of course we have plants that you would expect to see in a shoreline area like this, of irises, and we have yellow flag and white flag and blue flag iris, and we have marsh betony, and we have a lot of other shoreline plants around this pond. So if you have a wetland, whether it's a retention area or a wet ditch even, you don't have to be stuck with cattails and grasses as your shoreline plants. You can get a lot of flowering plants that are quite showy, that are perennial, that you have low maintenance on. You can't overwater these plants, and so you can just plant them into the wet soil and they'll take off. Now look on the labels for the plants. If it says it wants moist soil, then put it up near the top. If it says that it needs to have 2 or 3 inches of water over the roots, then put it lower down to the bottom. So just read the labels and you'll see every area of the country has plenty of these kinds of plants. Some of them grow in the sun, some grow in the shade, some are deeper in the water, some are shallower. And just start looking and you'll find many different kinds of plants that'll easily grow in these wet areas. A lot of water gardens have a rubber liner and don't have any rocks in the pond at all. And the plants are always in pots. Pots blow over and they become hard to maintain. The fish will nibble at the mud and make a muddy mess. And so it's really, sometimes difficult to take care of those plants. So imagine taking those plants out of their plastic flower pot and putting them into a rock flower pot. On the shelf, even this, if you have a rock water garden, rocked in water garden, you can do this. Everybody knows what a campfire ring looks like. Well, make half a campfire ring of rocks, bigger from grapefruit, pumpkin size, whatever will fit on that shelf. Make a ring of rocks or half ring of rocks and fill it with gravel. You now have a rock flower pot that these shoreline plants can grow in. And now again, you look at the label and you see that the plant needs to be lower in the water, then you put it on a lower shelf or you plant it deeper into that rock flower pot. If it says it needs to be in moist soil, then maybe you can plant it on the top edge of the rocks and let it spread out from there. So it's easy to make a very natural looking, low maintenance rock flower pot. And now the plants will be taking their nutrients out of the water and competing with algae as well. So this is a really great way to plant these plants, and it's lower maintenance and it looks prettier. And this has been a Greener View. Thanks for watching.